Okay, on to the next cost-saving speaker. So Matt Kraushar received his bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from Purdue University and then went on to earn a master's degree in restoration ecology. While at Purdue, Matt served as the habitat specialist for the Cooperative Extension Service for the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, where he provided land management consulting and training. Matt currently works for the Indiana Department of Transportation as a roadside maintenance specialist, where he's tasked with managing all activities pertaining to roadside maintenance. So welcome, Matt.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to put my extension hat on real fast. Everybody stand up and do one big stretch. Go ahead, real fast. And then I'm going to tell you to sit back down. So I know that these things can really get pretty in-depth sometimes. So, all right, cool. Let's get back to it here. So, thanks for having me, Iris, and the working group here. I'm pretty excited to be here. So I just learned about this program and this group, I don't know, about a month ago, actually, when we were at a meeting for a Monarch Summit in Indiana. And so I'm really happy to be here, and I'm going to have at least 150 slides that I'm going to try to buzz through. I'm kind of kidding there. I actually pared it down a little bit. So I'm going to do what I can to get through this in a timely manner. Please yank me off the stage when it gets to be that time. I'll definitely try to take questions towards the end if I have time for it. But one of the things that we have, and so I'm going to kind of go through a couple different scenarios and kind of go kind of a long way around to talk about this because of my background from extension and research, and then back to where I am currently. So right-of-ways, as you guys all know, as right-of-way managers, have a number of different challenges, and sometimes it may just be even a challenge of who our neighboring landowner may be, whether that's another right-of-way or a private landowner or a U.S. Forest Service property or some other aspect. So there's a lot of challenges that go on inside of a right-of-way. And then we have our own right-of-way as its own challenge, and so this is a photo that I took earlier this year that I looked at a number of different challenges all on one slope. We have issues with erosion, we have issues with vegetation that's growing, we have ditches that go through that may be faced with riprap, and then we have the shoulder area, and then some other utility lines that are within that same spot. I'm struggling in a lot of situations to be able to maintain vegetation for clear sight zones because of some of the things that I'm faced with, and I'm going to try to use this pointer. If you can see, this is an aggregate shoulder that is trying to grow grass. There's no soil there other than what's been kind of brushed off the edge of the pavement, and so ultimately that's going to be a challenge in and of itself from a vegetation management perspective, and it will always be that way no matter what method we actually try to utilize. Something that we didn't really talk about much with John's presentation, which was very informative to me, is that we maybe didn't even include the impact of invasive species and what those might actually have in that grand overall scheme. We kind of think about commonly a static system where it's going to be something that is going to respond to our vegetation, but if we don't really consider some of the other introducing impacts that may come into play, sometimes those things can skew some of our activities. And then we also have other challenges when it comes to the pesky landowners that we commonly have. So as a utility right-of-way, we have a lot of easements and right-of-ways, and different people have different methods and different ideas of how those areas should be maintained. And so, and I didn't do a great job of citing some of these photos, and I apologize for the people that I've pirated these from on the internet. But that being said, we have once, and so I recently talked with my managers. So we have kind of 6 different districts within the state DOT in Indiana, and so we have different wants, and sometimes the want kind of looks like this, kind of that golf course-esque kind of an idea of, I want my grass 6 inches tall, green all the way to the edge of the fence, clean cut right up to the edge of the pavement, whereas we have needs where we actually need to be able to maintain sight distance. And so these are things that I pulled off the internet, but in real life, we have wants, and so I look at that photo and I say, man, it looks really good. We don't need to mow that. We don't need to do anything with it. We have no site restrictions. We have no issues. But in reality, that's just a couple days away from being mowed because that's what people want. Whereas we have a situation like this, which is a need situation, and I took this photo later in the year, and unfortunately for us, this is one of those native grass species that kind of finds itself being a weedy problem in certain intersections sometimes in big blue stem. And so this is a timely thing that we have to be able to adjust and adapt to depending on what our practices may be. moving forward kind of away from the wants and needs, the reality of the system is we have a lot of things that are out there that are big challenges, and we're faced with safety as well as infrastructure maintenance, and being able to provide an overall aesthetically pleasing site as well. John talked about a number of the vegetation management options that we have in our dispose, whether that's the use of chemical, mechanical treatments. I've used this slide for years and years and years trying to promote the idea of IVM, and it's a combination of all the above. And the one thing from an ecological standpoint we have to kind of consider, we heard this earlier from John, and I wrote it down because I liked it, was chemically induced or chemically facilitated biological control. And so the idea there is that competition is a strong factor in vegetation management, but we have to be able to harness that. And so I'm going to talk through some of the things that that I've kind of found through time that we can really utilize to our advantage if properly implemented. So I'm going to put my researcher hat on from many years ago when I was at Purdue, and we started a case study, and I'm going to talk through that to provide you with the business case of kind of what we've tried to do and implement. And so ultimately a system that was mowed for years and years and years, 3 times a year, looked like this. Okay. Grass really wasn't the problem. The idea was we were going out to mow the roadside, period. And so that may not be overly problematic, but it does cause some potential site restrictions that may actually go on there. And just for reference, anytime you see a picture like that, that board's about 3 feet tall. And so there's a number of different species that are within that. And if you notice, the grass is about 1 foot tall. And so this was mowed, and this is, 2 months, maybe a month after mowing treatment. So the grass is not actually causing the issue. It's actually some of the other vegetation that's within that area. And so I've given this presentation or parts of this presentation all over the country, and so most of you I think are kind of from the Midwest, and so this is kind of immaterial, but there's a number of different species, and these species may be found all across various rights of way across the country, whether that's herbaceous or woody vegetation or even just a grassy material. So the whole project, my name wasn't even on the project. I just kind of helped facilitate it. So there was another graduate student that worked on this, and some of my student workers at the time worked on these projects. And so one of the things that I think we sometimes struggle with in the research side of things is actually doing a project that's big enough to be able to show somebody something. So in the herbicide industry, when I would do herbicide test plots, my plot may be 1 foot by 1 foot, 3 feet by 3 feet, 10 feet by 10 feet. And in reality, to be able to show something and be able to take up natural variation, we need to do something bigger. So we did some very large, in terms of research, plots that we actually had, mile-long stretches where we tried to do these things and try to be able to show our half-mile treatments. And we had these all scattered across the state to try to look at variations within the state, the soils that were there, the maintenance regiments that were in place beforehand, before this study took place, and try to kind of tease out some of the various things. And ultimately, we were attempting to be able to show a cost savings. That's what we wanted to try to do with the project, which is what everybody's most interested in the long term. And the other aspect of this that I'm not going to talk a lot about is some stuff with the native warm season grass plantings, trying to identify certain species that may be more beneficial or more useful on our rights-of-way. And if there's time at the end, I'll give you a kind of an unfortunate ending to that kind of a part of the study. So we took samples and samples and samples and samples of vegetation, and ultimately we had about 75% grass was making up our plant community within that first 18 to 20 feet of the roadside. Which is probably what you would expect. Green as you drive down the road, it's mostly grass. We had about 12% broadleaf cover, and then kind of the interesting aspect of that is we had about 13% bare ground. And that was not uncommon. In fact, in a lot of situations we had more than 13% bare ground, and that may be a result of mowing practices, salinity issues, compaction, aggregate type things within that area. And so the big reason that I'm kind of bringing that up is that means 25% of our area is what I would deem undesirable, or a chance for invasion, or a chance for a problem. And so that is ultimately kind of a challenge in that first, that clear zone inside that first 30 feet or so of that particular right-of-way. As every researcher has problems sometimes, you might not be able to quite make out what that little yellow sign in the middle says, but that's a do not mow or spray sign. And this area here was my untreated control, and one of the neighbors decided they were going to mow it for me. And so sometimes maybe we just need to leave it alone, and somebody's going to take care of it for us. And so Unfortunately, we can't expect that all the time, but sometimes we do have those kinds of challenges that are there. So I know that I'm going to get some pushback on all the information about herbicides, but I'm going to try to utilize that as a kind of a stepping stone for how this all works in the long run to produce a program of vegetation management, integrated vegetation management. And so the details of the rates and all the things that are here from an herbicide perspective are not all that important. But what we were trying to look at was mowing combined with broadleaf weed control and the possibility of increasing or inputting a plant growth regulation or seed head suppression on the vegetative growth to see if we could eliminate mowing cycles. But we also wanted to look at the number of mowing cycles, how fast that vegetation grew back, and where it was deemed acceptable and unacceptable versus a 1 cycle, a 2 cycle, and then an untreated control where we didn't mow it at all. And so this is a very busy slide, but what I kind of want to be able to show you is that when we do herbicide treatments, we're actually able to effectively control the broadleaf plants, the undesirable species within this particular area. When we do mowing, we do very little to control that, a mechanical treatment. We do 2 mowings. We do very little to control that vegetation within that area as compared to the untreated control. Okay, and so that's kind of the take-home message here with regards to what goes on, and I'm going to kind of buzz through these things. We have very good success at controlling the broadleaf weeds within a given area at various different rates. We looked at this in another year to make sure that what we thought the first year was kind of going to take place. We changed some rates up and looked at different things to find out if we had any major impact. And again, we kind of come up with the same concept, right? We're able to have very good control of the undesirable species within that right-of-way, that first 30 feet, that clear zone, compared to what the untreated control might be. And I wanted to kind of call this out, the idea of that bare ground issue. We have a standard mowing cycle. And on this particular area, we had a lot of scalping and actual rutting that took place from the mowers actually going through there, which would have been 3 times in this particular location. So that's not an uncommon thing, which maybe lead for more invasion from other species and other undesirable stuff. So again, same kind of thing. I'm going to show you another couple of photos of how effective we are at being able to control the undesirable species within that outside edge of our treatment. No treatment on the left and treatment on the right. Again, a treatment in both of these situations, and again, I run into things where I have somebody that, and so this photo on the left-hand side here, so both of these had the same treatment, same herbicide treatment. I had very good control out to about the edge here, and I have some desirable milkweed species along the outside edge. I'm very happy with that. This would be kind of considered my clear zone within that particular area based on the speed limit and everything that goes on there. But even though I had that kind of success where I was able to keep that clear zone available, the neighbor, the landowner, decided he wanted to mow that same area, same treatment area. To what end? What did he accomplish? What was the need there? Well, it's because I wanted to be able to mow that particular spot. I want versus need. So to get away from some of the photos and pictures here, I've got a few very busy slides with regards to what we're looking at from a broadleaf cover, and you're going to see several of these in a quick succession here. But I want to be able to kind of draw attention to herbicide treatments, mowing, untreated control. And so what you see from a broadleaf cover perspective at time of treatment, we all had very similar treatments or very similar cover. We do the herbicide treatment, we're able to really reduce that broadleaf cover versus mowing, 2 mowings versus no mowing. And so if you notice, there's very, very little change between those 2 things, and that's, again, a result that mechanical treatments aren't able to control these things. Grass height after our treatments compared to the untreated control, same kind of situation. We're looking at stuff that the untreated control is going to have some higher vegetation that's there, but without any mowings whatsoever, we're actually able to keep up with the same as what we do with 1 mowing cycle. There's a little blip here because there was a mowing about the time that information was collected. And so we ultimately end up with a very similar response of herbicide versus mowing at the time of actually harvesting this information throughout time. So we're very comparable with just doing a single herbicide application and no mowings whatsoever. So that's kind of fine and dandy if we want to look at it within 1 growing season, but we want to look at it 1 year out. And so what you're going to see here is that this is the 12-month after application scenario, and so we're looking at broadleaf weed cover. And so with our mowing and our untreated control, we have very similar cover, and when we have an herbicide application even 1 year out, we're having very good control of that particular, of those various species that are there. Again, just another manner of being able to look at this for your ease, depending on what people like to look at from a figure perspective. So we go even further out and we look at 24 months out, so 2 years. I didn't really collect much data for that because sometimes our research budgets don't allow for some of these types of things to take place. But a mowing treatment, we see all kinds of scattered weeds within that area, versus an herbicide treatment, we have a very clear area specified through that area. So what's my point? I've read hundreds of machine-based manuals, and not a single one of them has an EPA registration number associated with it for controlling vegetation. All it does is mechanically reduce the height, okay? And so that's all we're actually doing when we do a mechanical treatment. We're not actually controlling that particular species. And so having this tool of herbicides within our toolbox is something that's very important for trying to have a vegetation management program, an integrated program. So before you kind of yell at me and say that, hey, don't tell me how to do my own job, I understand that. There are various components and things that go into that. And so the results from this study ultimately drove the development of an integrated approach, a zonal approach, which is very common on utility rights of way in terms of being able to kind of have that selective zone and then moving out, clear zone, selective zone, and then kind of a more of a natural zone. And I apologize for the clarity of this particular slide, but you can kind of get the gist of we have a clear zone, a selective zone, and then kind of a natural zone as our right-of-way allows. And so that was developed, and so this was back in 2014. At that time, I was doing some other work, so my predecessor kind of put this stuff all together, and we were actually even recognized through the Federal Highway for some of our activities, and I say R as in NDOT's activities, for native vegetation and planting of pollinator things, and so things we're kind of off to a great start. We had some pretty good recognition. Things were looking very, very good. And so, again, a very, very busy slide of cost and numbers. And so one of the issues that, or things I guess to kind of draw attention to is that these are numbers that I pulled through some of our tracking systems. And with data coming from those systems, there's a lot of issues with inputs. So people fat finger numbers and everything else, and so there's some potential for some errors in some of this stuff, but it gives a pretty accurate representation. And so you're looking at calendar year, and then a total cost per acre. This is for our machine mowing, our mechanical treatments, and then this is for like our mowing and trimming and spot mowing type stuff. And so the costs associated with that are quite a bit higher because of mobilization costs and things like that. That management plan was actually introduced around 2014, 2015 timeframe, and so you see that potentially we have some reduction in cost associated with that because of our change in practice and trying to be selective and do things a little bit differently from the original status quo. Similarly, this is for our herbicides. The top set is for broadcast applications, and that's primarily focused on the first 30 feet of roadway. And then the spot treatments is kind of anything that we're doing outside of that first 30 feet in terms of attacking a patch of Canada thistle, or maybe doing cut surface treatments on brush or something like that. And so, unfortunately for this, we do see a change through time of some cost reduction for our broadcast applications, mostly because of changes in efficiency. We really ramped up our number of acres, however, in terms of being able to actually treat more acres and effectively treat more acres. And then so from a spot treatment perspective, we're seeing our price kind of slightly increase, but really kind of stays pretty close to an average from year to year to year. We do see an increase through time with our spot treatments, and so the number of acres that we're actually treating after that, the introduction of this plan, and so we're actually doing more and more spot treatments than what we did in the past, and the costs are, again, relatively staying the same. So, again, a very, very busy slide with lots of numbers. All of this information is public use, so I'm able to put this stuff up here. But so our in-house costs versus contract costs, these things are very difficult to compare apples to apples because of how we track these things, and that's one of the hurdles that I'm trying to kind of overtake. But generally speaking, we mow in-house roughly 50,000 acres at $58 an acre, and those kind of break down for the machine mowing. This is a 4-year average. Contract stuff, we look at stuff in a mile base, which I think is kind of a problem that I'm hoping to try to overcome, that I'm not able to compare these things. And so I kind of get some estimated acres associated with that based on some distances, and realistically the contract mowing may be a little bit more expensive, but takes that workforce and puts it back into some other project is kind of the idea of why we do some contract mowing. Our manual brush cutting is very expensive. When you start to consider the idea of having truck, trailer, chipper, follow vehicle, men out there with chainsaws and all the safety gear that goes on with it, plus an herbicide application as part of the cut surface stuff, it's very expensive to be able to do that versus our herbicide applications are relatively cheap. And so these are some of the things that I've been trying to kind of put forth to some of our managers. So these numbers are a little bit on the older side and maybe a little bit skewed, maybe not quite perfectly accurate because it didn't take in at the time that when I was put this stuff together for some of the benefits and stuff like that associated with our selective weeding versus our mowing. But in reality, those would both go up in terms of the overall dollar that's attached to that. But I think if there's a take-home slide, this is probably it, showing the impact that we can have in terms of dollars and man-hours for the selective treatment versus a mowing, and understanding that if we're able to utilize a selective treatment at $30 an acre versus mowing at $50 an acre, the amount of time that it takes us to mow is nearly 3x of what it actually is going to be for our herbicide application. So if I can take out one of those mowing cycles, I can save a lot of time and a lot of money. And so that's the idea of what we tried to push forward with the implementation of this IVM program. The other cost, we talked about some benefits or kind of the lack of being able to pick up some of the benefits that go along with that. We've had a number of litigation issues associated with vegetation stuff over the last couple of years. This happens everywhere. It's a real thing. And so as this really breaks down, several $1 million worth of potential cost associated with a lack of attention to vegetation management. And so those are costs that maybe aren't factored into what our actual overall program might actually be and what it actually runs. And so we also have some potential change for some damage complaints or something that might come from our herbicide application itself going into a neighbor's field and impacting a crop. In this case, a claim of like 1.4 million for a tobacco field. And so that kind of stuff is real. And so there's some challenges with that. But really, what is the cost that comes with a complaint from a customer complaint? If you have a customer of the motoring public or the public of Indiana or your state, and that complaint is there, what's that cost to you, and how do you actually tabulate that cost? Well, there's a response cost, right? Going out and trying to appease that complaint, but there's also the idea of not having buy-in from that particular landowner and potentially some of the people that they work with and deal with. So I talked about efficiencies. Commonly, one of the issues that I hear when I talk to groups is, well, I have issues with equipment. I don't have the equipment that I actually need. Well, you can be pretty creative and come up with a solution. And so in this situation, what we had is we had no ability to be able to go out and buy really expensive spray rigs, but we have trucks and trucks and trucks that utilize anti-icing equipment, that have pumps, that have flow meters, that have all the things that we possibly need to be able to do. And so we were actually able to bump up our production, the number of acres that we could actually treat, by simply doing some small conversions to that anti-icing piece of equipment and be able to utilize that year-round. So, we get this start to be implemented within the state in certain locations, and we try to do it very kind of isolated, and it was done very isolated initially. And ultimately, by implementing the IVM concept, we were able to mow 10,000 less swath miles. A swath mile is 4 feet by an acre, or by a mile, sorry, and that produces what we would refer to as a swath mile. And so we actually ultimately end up saving $240,000 in this particular situation, and we do have an increase in herbicide cost. We did go from $0 to $100,000, but $100,000, you do the math there, 240 less 100,000, we're still 140,000 in the green in that regard. So we're coming out ahead. And now ultimately the question kind of comes is the public satisfied with this situation? And ultimately, yes, we're still going to receive complaints because you can paint a building red and somebody's going to say it doesn't look good, and you can paint a building blue because the person that wanted it red or didn't like it being red is going to want it to be blue. So it doesn't really matter what you actually accomplish. You're still going to end up with some challenges there. So one of the other aspects there that I didn't touch a lot about is the idea of competition. And so one of the things from our vegetation on our roadside is we have warm season grasses or warm season vegetation, we have cool season vegetation, and so understanding how those species react to maintenance can be very beneficial to how you time your applications of treatments, especially when it comes to mowing. So how many of you in here mow your yard? Right, everybody, unless you have some kind of a xeric landscape or something like that, which is pretty unusual because you get weird looks from your neighbors. And so I've had, I mow my yard, weekly or every other week, depending on the amount of rainfall that we have and how fast that vegetation grows. Well, so what you hear me saying is that I mow it every week or every 2 weeks, so I can do that all the rest of the season because it's going to get to a certain height and I'm not going to be happy with it. Well, if I time my mowing treatments on a cool season grass, once it's produced its seed head, it's going to stay at that height that I mow it at for really the remainder of the season because it goes relatively dormant during the warm weather. And then similarly, if I time my mowing for the fall, after my warm season grasses have produced their seed heads, they're also not going to bolt and go right back to the point where they are now an issue. And so understanding that timing is very, very important, and being able to communicate that can be a bit of a challenge. So what's my point? And I'm going to try to end on time as best I can here, but vegetation management is a science. There's a lot of information that has to be collected, both from the efficacy of the treatment, but also the dollars and what actually, the dollars and cents to make sense of it. And so my overall herbicide treatments are faster, they're cheaper, and they actually last longer than what our mechanical treatments do, and that's very easy to be able to demonstrate that in terms of effect on the vegetative community that's there. And realistically, these things can be put into any kind of model system that's there. Now, I had this epiphany yesterday on my drive up here, and I kind of thought to myself, after looking through all those numbers, well, I haven't seen any major changes in the budgets that are being utilized for these for the maintenance program for our vegetation management stuff. And so I kind of thought to myself, why is that? And so I kind of started thinking through some of the challenges that are associated with that, and budget is going to be a huge one because that impacts the amount of people that we have. And I commonly get this from my managers, my land managers, is me and what army? How do you expect me to be able to treat 10,000 acres? It's very, very difficult to be able to do that. We have a tremendous problem with turnover, people moving on to a different position or moving somewhere else. That can be a bit of a challenge from educating those individuals to be able to do the next best thing. Equipment challenges can be very difficult. And then recently I've been having a lot of discussions with regards to the balancing act. If I bring in more money from something, I have to take it from something else. And so that can be a very challenging bit. So getting past the wants versus needs concept, like I showed earlier, the old way versus, kind of the way that we have to kind of move forward to be more proactive versus reactive, and then educating the public and having some level of ownership. And I'm getting the hook right now, so I'm going to say thank you. And what I do have is a link, or, well, it's kind of a link, to the study that actually took place here from a reference perspective to be able to look at that if you're interested in. And now I'll take questions. How about that? Yeah, what do you think? One question. I'm allowed one question, apparently.